Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Dylbozer's Den, and today we're going to be discussing the newest release from New Zealand's own Ulcerate and their album, Cutting the Throat of God. This is the first release from the band in 4 years, with their prior release, Stare Into Death and Be Still. Both of these albums have been released through the label Debemur Morty Productions. If you are unfamiliar with the band started in 2002 and has a total of 7 full lengths, with this being the 7th. The band is known for its dissonance, its uneasy feelings, doom and dread, and evoking the feelings of negative emotions. You know, you might compare a band like this to Neurosis, to Portal, to Gorguts, Bloodos Nord, which they share a label with. The band consists of 3 members, that being Jamie St. Morat on drums, percussion. He also did the recording, the engineering, the mixing, and the artwork on this album. If you look to my left here, it's a very striking piece of artwork. And while listening to the album, I was definitely drawn to that artwork and being able to put that image into my head. This band is no stranger to their intense and very eye-catching artwork. If you look at their most recent release, Stare Into Death and Be Still, you'll get a really good glimpse into the effort this band puts into releasing any product. The band is then rounded out by bassist and vocalist Paul Kellen and guitarist Michael Haggard. While Jamie did record the band, it was not mastered by him. It was mastered by Magnus Lindberg of Cult of Luna fame, who has a laundry list of acts he's worked with, such as Bosk, Chained to the Bottom of the Ocean, Cowardice, Russian Circles, and Tribulation. Stare Into Death and Be Still was released in 2020, actually right as everything fell apart for the world, right at the beginning of the pandemic. While a lot of us were home. So experiencing doom and dread with a release like that was very fitting of that time. It was the first season of the pandemic. Cutting the Throat of God started to take place right around November of 2021 with some of the early writing sessions. It seems to have gone on from there. The recording of this album took place between September and December of 2023. It seems that the pandemic may not have allowed bands to tour, play shows, do much of anything to promote any records. So what else do? When you're a creative person, you create more and you create more because you have all the time in the world to do that. To dig into the album a little bit, you'll notice that this band has, throughout the years, written really dense and really just all-consuming records. The band puts a lot of effort, as I mentioned with the artwork, into every single facet of what they do. They think out every single thing. It seems like they definitely put it through a blender of sorts. This band goes over everything with a fine-tooth comb, changes parts around. It definitely feels that way with the way the songs are coming out. So let's kick right in. To Flow Through Ashen Hearts is the opening track of this. Sounds a little bit more post-metal at the beginning of this track, a la Isis, something off of like a Wavering Radiant, Oceanic, Panopticon. You pick your album. And it just kicks right in, and you're immediately kicked right into these almost a soundscape of dissonance and these melodic passages that this band has become more prevalent with throughout the years. The drumming on this album by Jamie really makes him the MVP of this record, at least in my opinion. I'm not a person that pays attention closely to drums or drummers in particular, but it's become known that he is kind of this center technical point of all these records, and not to overshadow the other 2 guys in the band, Paul and Michael. But the drumming on here it definitely feels almost like it's off the cuff, like nothing's written, because it's playing to every single part in such a way. It's very meticulous. It's very precise. It's very thought out when it comes to all this. And you get a really good representation of the opening track, The Dawn is a Hollow, and Transfiguration In and Out of Worlds, where there's just these tremendous fills that will lead into different parts. This isn't an album that you could particularly just pick a track out and listen to. It needs to be listened to as a large whole piece, because of the way it's structured, because of the way it's thought out. There's not necessarily one riff in particular that sticks out on this record, because it's not a riff album. There are riffs, there are parts in it, there are sections in it that would definitely stick out a little bit more. This is an album that definitely has to be thoroughly listened to. You've got to put the time and effort into any of this band's projects. You know, it makes me think of maybe like a Neurosis through Silver and Blood or Times of Grace, where you have to pay attention to it. There's so much going on. There's so many different layers. You've got Michael, who is the lone guitar player in the band, and he is playing and recording parts on the record that seems like it would be 1 to possibly 3 guitar players being played. And it's different sections on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, and they're all layering together. With this band being a three-piece and a three-piece only, you've got guitar parts on this album that aren't necessarily what you would consider a classic riff. It's not just that. There are riffs on this record, but the way the guitar is structured on here, it's more of a layer. It's more of a soundscape instrument. You've got guitars all over it. The gain is dialed back even so you can hear every single individual note, and it really adds to the clarity of it. But Michael Haggard is recording 2 to 3 guitar parts that would be played by 2 to 3 different musicians, it seems, all alone. Being able to see him replicate this live would be really interesting. You definitely have aspects, and you get to hear really good representation. This is Further Opening the Wound, Transfiguration, In and Out of Worlds, To See Death Just Once, to name a few tracks. Speaking on Transfiguration, In and Out of Worlds, that might be my favorite song on the record, aside from the closing track. But Transfiguration, In and Out of Worlds, the bass is really cutting through at the beginning of this, where you've got a cleaner kind of guitar scape, and that really distorted fat low end is kicking in. Paul may not get the most representation on this record because he is the bassist in this facet, in which in a lot of death metal and black metal and extreme metal bands, the bass can sometimes be buried in the mix a little bit, as we've discussed on past reviews. But he's kind of the fundamental on this record. He's kind of the bedrock holding everything together. He's the most grounded on this, where you've got drums that are really wild and technically challenging and proficient. And you have these guitars that are, otherworldly. And you get these different soundscapes with that and all these different parts. Whereas Paul has a great sound on this record. I think the distorted, low end centric tone that he's got is great for this album in particular. And it really glues everything together. And when it does stick out, it's more impactful with the dynamics of it. But back on the track, this is the song that I first noticed, one of my favorite riffs on the record, which comes into 3-minute and 12-second point. Then you go into To See Death Just Once, which I wanted to bring up this with some of the band's influences. You've got a lot of black metal influence on this track from bands such as Dissection. They're famous for albums such as The Somber Lane. Emperor influence on here, at least to my ear. I'm hearing Into the Nightside Eclipse, Anthems of Welcome Dust. I'm also catching much deeper and dissonant black metal influences such as Blood Aus Nord and Deathspell Omega. This, again, is probably my favorite of the singles that were released for this album. There were 3 in total: The Dawn is Hollow, To Flow Through Ashen Hearts, To See Death Just Once. It's hard to pick tracks off this album just to say our favorite, because as a whole, this album is so enjoyable, so negative, and one of the most unsettling bands I've ever listened to in my entire life. To wrap this all up, I will say the self-titled track is kind of the magnum opus on this record. It represents every single thing you want to hear on the album that you've heard before. Ties the record together at almost an hour in length. This is an intense record to listen to for that amount of time. There's no rest in it. There's no subtlety. The emotions that are evoked on this album can run the gambit. And having to listen to something like this for an hour long, even out of enjoyment like myself, you need to listen to a pick-me-up after this. And sometimes that pick-me-up may be an old school death metal record, or hell, maybe a pop record, or maybe something positive. You definitely need to pick me up after this. Go outside, get in the sun, touch some grass. Cutting the Throat of God is a magnificent record. I've been waiting for this for 4 years. To Stare Into Death and Be Still, released at the early part of the pandemic, completely changed my world. Definitely set me in motion of the amount of dissonance that I wanted to hear out of death metal records or black adjacent records or whatever. This is an album that deserves your full undivided attention. The band puts so much effort and time into writing these tracks, writing their records. They barely even do interviews based off of that fact alone. They want to make sure that the questions that are being asked of them are having the same amount of time, dedication, and thought put into them as they would their records, because they are going to put the same amount of time into their answers given to that interviewer. Let me know what you guys thought. Is there something you want me to review next? Check us out on X, check us out on Facebook, check us out on Instagram, and we'll be back with another episode of the Riff Worship Podcast pretty soon, as well as another episode of the Dylbozer's Den. Until then, thank you guys.